Okay, hello. Welcome to the Riga Security Forum 7th podcast in our series. My name is Imants Lieģis. I'm a senior fellow at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs, who is organizing the forum this year once again. And our topic today is the improbability or the probability of a European security architecture, European Union and Russia. So as we know, this concept of a European security architecture was introduced by President Medvedev of Russia in 2008, during the time that he was president in the interregnum of President Putin's regimes, as it were. And the concept, I think if we look at what's happening in 2008, we had, of course, the Russian military intervention in Georgia. The year before, we had cyber attacks on Estonia. And it's probably right that when the concept of a security architecture on the part of Russia was introduced, this was not particularly well received, certainly here in Riga, and probably not in the region. But if you wanted to give a sort of favourable spin to it, there were those who really said that this may be a vision of security for Europe in the 21st century being proposed by our Russian partners at the time. The other way in which we were quite cautious about the proposals was there was a concern that of course, it was something that may split up the NATO alliance and weaken the transatlantic link, as it were. Well, now, if we fast forward to today and where we are, I think it's probably right to say that this concept of the European security architecture has not really raised its head much over in recent times. And so it seems improbable that it will be introduced in the future. But, and this is probably because the reality of Putin's Russia is that he, over the last few years, as we've seen, has introduced military and political warfare into the European security scene. And I think as a result, he's probably destroyed many of the hopes that people may have attached to these particular ideas. Nevertheless, Europe, of course, has to coexist with Russia, even if we can't agree on a common architecture, or, as Gorbachev said, the common European home. Anyway, in order to discuss these conflicting visions about European security, we're very pleased to welcome two very distinguished experts today who will discuss these topics. Firstly, we will speak with Professor Mark Galeotti, who's the Principal Director of Mayak Intelligence. He's an honorary professor at the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies and a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Service Institute and a very well-known expert on Russia, of course. And then we will have with us Marcin Terlikowski, who is the head of the International Security Program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and Marcin is an expert on European defence and security, as well as both from the European Union and from the NATO aspect. So once again, thanks very much, both of you, for being with us today. And I'd like to start off with you, Mark, and ask you whether the European security architecture, really whether it's something that merits any considerations today, given what has happened since it was proposed, and whether you feel that Russia sees the European Union as a possible partner for discussing European security architecture.
Well, I'm going to have to start with the sort of depressingly ambivalent academic's answer of it depends what you mean by European security architecture. Because clearly, when the Russians were proposing it, it was a disingenuous attempt to undermine NATO and to essentially uncouple Europe from the United States. The United States still being, after all, Europe's greatest security guarantor so far. So that was their notion of a security architecture. However, it doesn't mean that actually there is no scope whatsoever for using this as a way of, it's always reopening conversations that do need to be had. And in many ways, this links in with your second point about how the Russians themselves look at the European Union. And let me be blunt, I mean, I tend to slightly sort of overstate the issue, but I don't think it's too much of an overstatement to question whether or not the Kremlin really believes the European Union exists. I mean, they know there is such an institution. There is, after all, a representative in Moscow. There is a blue flag with gold stars and so forth. But the notion that there is a European Union as a specific body, which in some ways has an identity, we can even put it an ideology of its own, rather than it just simply being an arena in which different European powers battle for supremacy and hegemony over the others. That's something that they still seem to have trouble with. And the Russians themselves always want to work on a bilateral basis. Firstly, because it's the kind of foreign policy that they understand. And secondly, because clearly the European Union as a bloc is much more powerful than Russia on many indices. I mean, even in military terms, although clearly there is a lot to be done in order to make the European Union in any way a plausible hard power force. But nonetheless, even there, it is not negligible. And therefore, the Russians would much rather be dealing with individual nations, which obviously have that much more vulnerability, and Russia has a stronger position. So in some ways, discussions about a European security architecture, if handled properly and not in any way a way of dismantling NATO, but supplementing NATO, actually would have scope. And it creates an opportunity for the European Union to present itself precisely as, shall we say, a hard power interlocutor with Russia. Because while I certainly don't subscribe to the view that force is the only thing the Russians understand, that's absolutely not the case. But on the other hand, military power is something they pay a lot more attention to. And discussions about security are certainly ones that are much more likely to get onto Putin's desk these days than discussion of the European Union as a regulatory superpower or all these other sort of alternative forms of strength with which the European Union sort of likes to sort of mantle itself. So, lengthy answer, the short version is yes, but absolutely not in the terms that Moscow was originally advancing.
Yeah, so basically, I think we can agree that it shouldn't necessarily be dismissed entirely as a concept if it can be used in a positive way. Certainly, it's not the only concept that is perhaps being perceived as supplementing NATO, because we have within Europe all the discussions about strategic autonomy in any event, but that's something perhaps we can touch on later. So, Marcin, coming over to you, the European Union and European security architecture probably doesn't figure. They're focusing a little bit on something called the strategic compass. I know you're an expert on the strategic compass issues, so perhaps you can let us have your thoughts on how Russia figures in the European Union debates on these topics of a security architecture, and whether Russia figures within the discussions on the strategic compass, for example.
Well, Imants, I think that the most important issue is the definition issue, which Mark already touched upon. So if we speak about the broad understanding of European security architecture, which involves a number of institutions, European Union being one of them, but also NATO, also the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, to some extent also the Council of Europe. It involves also treaties, arms control treaties, military risk reduction treaties. Some of them expired or dropped by Russia. These are elements which make the EU only, let's say, a puzzle in a piece of a puzzle. And it is therefore hard to imagine that the EU would be the format, would be the vehicle which would generate a new momentum for discussing the future of European security autonomy, European security architecture. This is simply a way bigger concept which involves, perhaps in the first place, the role of the future US engagement in European politics, in European defenses, and the military aspects, which the EU is not that strong on. Yet, you mentioned the strategic compass, a unique exercise given the record of the European Union, an exercise which is meant to provide a new, let's say, way of thinking about what the European Union should do in the defense area, and on the basis of the conclusions from this strategic compass, the concrete actions regarding European military capabilities and other European tools in the area of defense will be taken. Here, Russia does feature. We don't have publicly available drafts of the strategic compass. It will be adopted only in spring next year, but we know that Russia is widely considered by a number of European Union member states and institutions as a threat to European Union, as a source of threats in the political area, in the military domain, obviously, but also in the what is now described as hybrid warfare, gray zone area, so disinformation, propaganda, cyber attacks. Most recently, weaponization together with Belarus of the migration crisis on the border between Belarus and the EU. Russia is now understood to generate threats, a number of different kinds of threats for the EU. Hence, the strategic compass, I cannot imagine otherwise, will somewhat relate to that. The problem I can see is that, again, the EU is only a piece in this puzzle of European security architecture. And because of the differences in the approaches to Russia among member states, some of which do not feel directly threatened by Russia and would like to develop and deepen selective cooperation, economic cooperation, like the case of Nord Stream 2, the pipeline linking Germany and Russia directly. These member states do not subscribe to the, let's say, the conclusion that the EU should be more robust in its approach to Russia. Here, this lack of unity may lead to, let's say, inconclusive results of strategic compass and to concentration of the strategic compass on something what has little to do with European security architecture, namely the crisis management in the southern neighborhood of Europe, something what is considered perhaps a kind of sole responsibility of the European Union. That would be bad if that happened, but this is the state of play as of today. Despite the continued war in Ukraine, despite the ongoing aggression in this hybrid gray zone area, Russia is not unifying European Union member states in their thinking about the future relationship with Russia.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Mark, you have stated that the aim of Russia is to divide, destabilize and distract, amongst other things. Now, is that the agenda for Russia vis-à-vis European security? You mentioned that, of course, Russia prefers to deal with power players. The power of the European Union or their position as a powerful player has not really emerged. You know, if we're talking about NATO, we see, of course, the pretty diabolical or the very low level of relations now between NATO and Russia because of the closing of the respective missions, etc. And the European Union is still finding its feet towards being a global actor. But what do you feel are Russia's aims, if not to pick us off bilaterally, as you mentioned, to deal bilaterally with countries rather than with the institution? And do you envisage any changes taking place in the immediate future? Because given that it's the power vertical in Moscow and Putin really is in control of these issues, is there anything we can do to promote any changes?
Well, there's always scope for changes, even if they are only in terms of changing the risk calculus, the sense of which particular tactics are or are not usable. I mean, to go on to the issue of Russia's goals, I mean, division and such like, I mean, they are absolutely, again, they are means to an end rather than an end in and of themselves. If one looks at what seem to be the objectives of Putin, and not just Putin, but that sort of cabal of people around him, who essentially share much of the same background. They're pretty much at the same age. Many of them were likewise ex-KGB or other sort of old Soviet security apparatus, and who are clearly grappling with that post-imperial moment of not really being able to cope with the idea that you are no longer a great global superpower. I mean, for these people, essentially, they believe that Russia has some kind of fundamental right to be considered a great power. And their notion of what a great power is frankly pretty 19th century. It's not about connectivity. It's not about soft power and economic dynamism and so forth. It's about having a sphere of influence, which for them are basically the post-Soviet states, with the exception of the Baltic states, which I think they've more or less accepted as lost. It's about not wanting to bring down the structures of global order, but basically being able to, from time to time, ignore them. And it's also about the fact that a great power, in their view, has to have a voice, and a voice means a veto, on every single major global issue that matters. Now, let's be perfectly honest, these are their aspirations. These are not something, this is nothing that we in Europe can or should allow them, because it would, for example, mean that precisely we would be willing to say to Ukraine, to Belarus, to Georgia, sorry guys, you belong to Russia, and your notion of sovereignty is entirely limited to what sovereignty Moscow is willing to give you. The trouble is that as far as the Russians are concerned, that means that we are the bad guys. We are the people who are actually trying to deny Russia its rightful place in the world. And I'm belaboring this not because in any way it justifies what they do, but I think we have to appreciate the extent to which, in their minds, Putin and co. are essentially acting defensively. As far as they're concerned, we are the ones trying to undermine them. When they look at what happened in Ukraine, when they look at what happens in Belarus, they see these not as the natural, organic risings of people finally who had enough of corrupt and unresponsive governments. They see them as hybridная война, hybrid war operations planned in Langley and imposed upon these countries as an anti-Russian act. I mean, it's easy just simply to frame it as frankly ludicrous paranoia, and there is a lot to that. But nonetheless, it is, I think, a genuinely felt one. So, I mean, in that context, in terms of what they want from Europe, I think more than anything else, they want to neutralize Europe. I mean, I think that is the key thing. There's no evidence of any, for example, territorial ambitions. Crimea was a particular specific example. It was a case of an area that basically pretty much every Russian, even the radical anti-Putin figures, regarded as rightfully Russian. But more, Europe represents a threat. It represents a threat potentially militarily. There are still those in Russia who do believe that at some point they might face a military thrust from NATO. More to the point, though, it represents a threat in terms of, as an example of an alternative route of development, a threat in terms of its capacity to undermine Russia's dominance over the region, whether it's through trade or political connections or whatever. So, I mean, for all these reasons, their aim is to have us precisely squabbling and neutralized. And in that context, in the grand scheme of things, we are not going to convince Putin otherwise. There is no communique we can give, which he will read and then suddenly have an epiphany and realize that in fact Europe is not aggressively trying to undermine his regime. So all we have to do is essentially to deter what we can and contain what we can't. And in that respect, actually, again, going back to the original point, anything that makes Europe and the European Union look more serious, more formidable, is a good thing. The problem for Europe at the moment is that precisely it is regarded as being negligible. As we saw with the treatment of Josep Borrell when he had his, frankly, rather ill-advised trip to Moscow. They went out of their way to essentially humiliate him because they wanted to basically communicate a message about how little they regarded the European Union and what happens if you don't treat Russia seriously in their point of view. So the ultimate answer is that obviously Russia is, in its current form, in other words, so long as Putin remains in the Kremlin, not going to become a friend or in any way a comfortable partner for the European Union. But when it comes down to it, these are ruthless but pragmatic individuals. There is not an ideological sort of message. It is in fact simply they will see what they can get away with. And therefore part of the reason for having a serious discussion about Europe as a security actor is to begin to communicate that in fact Moscow can get away with less than it had previously thought.
Okay, thanks for that. I mean, I think you've pointed to the fact that we have to deal with Russia and deal with Putin and his people as they are. But going back to the role of Europe and the European Union, Marcin, you mentioned also Belarus and Ukraine, both neighbouring countries of Poland, and for us extremely important from a regional perspective. What's your sense about what Europe, the European Union, can do vis-à-vis these countries? Clearly, we've seen that the movement over the last year within Belarus itself, a mutual neighbour of ours. There's the current issue about what to do with the airlines, which is on the agenda of the European Union. And do you think that anything that the European Union can do will help to fortify its role as a global player, for example?
Well, it's a complex and, let's say, multidimensional question, because as many member states there are in the European Union, then you would get as many answers on what it takes to have the European Union playing a global role. But taking up from where Mark stopped and answering to your question about Ukraine and Belarus, I think that we must not at all costs lose what enabled the peaceful transformation of post-communism and post-Soviet countries in 1990s and 2000s. So the enlargement of NATO and the EU. So the principle of an open door policy in NATO and the ability of candidate countries to finally accede the European Union. This is the biggest, the most powerful tool the Europe has vis-à-vis Russia, because even if this very much contributes to this sense of paranoia in Kremlin, which Mark mentioned, this is very much what lays in the fundamentals of the success of European Union, the ability of free nations to take sovereign decisions about the future. This is where the attractiveness of European Union lies for all post-Soviet countries and also other candidate countries too. So with regards to Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, we must not go towards this logic of zones of privileged influence, special interests of Russia. We may never say that what was promised with regards to the membership of Georgia and Ukraine in NATO, what was promised in the Bucharest summit in 2008, that it is not valid anymore. Quite on the contrary, we need to stick to these fundamental rules and principles, because if we don't, then we will start bargaining with Russia about the future of Europe, and we are likely to lose this bargaining because of the fact that we're not unified, and it will be very hard, or even harder in the future, to build a unified approach of European Union to Russia. So we should not even start a discussion about revising European security architecture or making the EU a vehicle for this kind of attempts to reach out to Russia to talk about strategic issues like the future of the Euro-Atlantic perspective of Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus for that matter. Of course, with Belarus now the situation is different. The country is on a fast path towards integrating with Russia, rather I would say being swallowed by Russia. There are many open source indicators showing that what is happening at the border between Belarus and the EU is being accepted or even advised by and supported by Russia. This is a situation which requires unity. This is a situation which requires response involving sanctions, political response, but also response involving migrant countries. And also, this is a situation which points to the fact that the EU has to still think about how to stabilize its southern neighborhood in other dimensions than the military dimension, which is now mostly debated in the strategic compass debates, the strategic compass process, which I mentioned before and you asked about. One final thing with regards to your question is that you may too often hear in Brussels and in some capitals that to make EU look robust in eyes of Russia or any other superpower, global power, the EU would need to adopt a kind of an equidistance policy. So distance itself alike from US, China, Russia, from these poles of power, if you wish, and create a pole of power in itself. This would be a big mistake, because this is precisely what Russia and China wants Europe to do, to basically dissolve and weaken the transatlantic bond. Quite on the contrary, the EU, to look robust in the eyes of Russia, would have to double down on the transatlantic bond and go towards this alliance of values and shared interest, which made which made the ground for the success of 1990s and early 2000s transformation of Central and Eastern Europe to free democratic nations, which are now members of both NATO and EU.
Okay, thanks, Marcin. You mentioned that from your perspective, Russia is in the process of swallowing up Belarus. Now, I've had some discussions just the last few weeks with some Russian colleagues, and they point out the fact that, look, Lukashenko has not recognized Crimea. Putin and Lukashenko have had 7 meetings, and Belarus is still a sovereign nation. Mark, what's your sense of this Russia-Belarus issue?
Well, obviously the Belarus crisis is a sort of massive challenge for Europe, but it's worth noting quite a challenge for Moscow as well. On a purely personal level, Putin and Lukashenko, it's well known, despise and mistrust each other. This has not been a happy relationship, not least because until very recently, Lukashenko maintained his autonomy precisely by playing Europe off against the Russians and vice versa. And when the popular movement, the popular protests first started, it's clear in Moscow that there were people thinking, actually, maybe this would be an opportunity to make of ourselves the good guys and also get rid of someone who has been a long-running thorn in our sides, and actually try and topple Lukashenko. Now, when it came down to it, Putin, who actually is really quite risk-averse, decided not to. Obviously, the example of people power bringing down a long-lasting autocrat was something that they decided would basically hit a little bit too close to home in Russia itself. So they are effectively yoked now to Lukashenko, but precisely he is clearly not realizing that his role is now meant to be the grateful yes man. As you said, he's not willing to recognize Crimea. He certainly is willing to speak out against Moscow whenever he feels like it. So I think that the Russians are in a quandary. At the moment, they have, in some ways, already got Belarus within their own security architecture through the structure of the so-called Union State. They have a base and a training zone there. It's not as if they particularly need or want anything more. It's more that if they are being pushed more and more into, in effect, bankrolling Belarus, there may come a point when they think, well, at the moment, if we're paying for it, we really ought to be running it. And they may feel pushed into that. But certainly, I mean, I'm in Moscow at the moment, and I'm not picking up in my conversations with people any enthusiasm for that. Belarus would be not just a sort of an economic cost if Moscow became fully responsible for it, but also there will be massive political international repercussions. So, I mean, I think that from Putin's point of view, there is a hope, and however ridiculous it is, that in a way the problem will go away or somehow resolve itself. They want to see, shall we say, Lukashenkoism without Lukashenko. They don't want to end up having to annex this place, and they certainly don't want to lose their existing security stake there. How they can square this circle, they honestly seem to have no idea.
Okay, thanks for that. We're drawing to a close gradually, but Marcin, perhaps a few more words on Ukraine. And you mentioned their aspirations to join NATO. We have a NATO foreign ministers meeting here in Riga coming up at the end of November. And clearly, neither Georgia or Ukraine is going to be offered the membership action plan. The whole question of the Normandy 4 format as a way of trying to resolve issues in Ukraine is not moving forward either. Chancellor Merkel is outgoing. President Macron will be up for re-election next year, presidential elections in the spring. Any ideas on the architecture for Ukraine?
Oh, it's $1 million question. But briefly, before jumping to Ukraine, one word about swallowing Belarus. My take is that Russia will not go for any kind of formal takeover, seizure of Belarus because of the repercussions you mentioned, and because of likely popular unrest, if not uprising, in Belarus, because many people would not accept it on a personal level to have a Russian rule. But like in a salami tactics, the Belarus may soon end up with a very facade sovereignty, with judiciary system, economic system being very much subordinated to Russia, and this is what I meant by swallowing by Putin's regime of this country. And now to Ukraine. What future holds for Ukraine is, of course, the matter of the decisions taken in Kremlin, but also the matter of the unity of the West. First of all, I think it's important to start with the repercussions of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and not even getting into the details about what the gas transit issue and how Ukraine depended on the revenue from the gas transit to Western Europe from Russia via Ukrainian gas system. But looking briefly at the political significance of the fact that the West would finally allow at some point, which is unfortunately, I think, likely, allow the Nord Stream 2 to become the main route of supplies of gas from Russia to Western Europe, to Germany, and then to Western Europe, with Ukraine being completely cut off. I mean, this would be read in Ukraine by Ukrainians as a proof of weakness of the West towards Russia. And if Ukraine is not compensated politically, economically, militarily, compensated with regards to its ability to stay resilient to Russian pressure, then we may very well see the current let's say, robustness of Ukraine's response to Russian pressure erode. And this would be very dangerous, because this is what Russia would like to see, a change coming from Kiev and from Ukraine society from within it, a change of its approach to the issue of the illegal occupation of Crimea, to the war in Donbass. So in practice, probably that would involve some kind of backing of the federalization plans proposed by Russia and making it kind of official line by Kiev. This would be a disaster. We need to show Ukrainians that we are able to arm Ukraine so that they can defend it themselves better, that we as European Union, as NATO, as the West, so together with the US, that we are committed to strengthening resilience of Ukraine to disinformation, propaganda, to manipulations in cyberspace, cyber attacks, and that we are committed to helping Ukraine with also signaling Russia that any military buildup now happening or starting to happen with regards to the Ukrainian Russian border, that any attempt of Russia to use military force openly again against Ukraine will entail serious consequences for Russia, further sanctions, further diplomatic repercussions, obviously, and further changes in NATO force posture in the eastern flank, because that would be, even if Ukraine is not a member of NATO, then any hot war coming back to Ukraine would mean that NATO would have to reinforce defenses in its easternmost allies. So speaking with the military language which Putin and Russia understands well. This is what we have to do now in the aftermath of the likely Nord Stream 2 decisions, not to lose Ukraine, because even if it doesn't happen overnight, then we may actually very well Ukraine may start going this path of eroding popular support for standing up to Russian threat in the aftermath of Nord Stream 2 being completely activated and transfers via Ukraine, gas transfers via Ukraine cut off. This is a very dangerous moment and a very important one at the same time.
Okay, well, on that, I wouldn't say optimistic note, but I think it's an important warning that you've given in closing, where I think we've touched on the fact that Ukraine is really essential to the makeup of any future European security architecture. And thanks very much for the insights to both of you on Ukraine, especially on Belarus. I think that's extremely important, because Belarus is very much on our agenda these days, also the agenda of the European Union. Of course, there are many other issues that we haven't had a chance to discuss, especially the American role in European security architecture. But nevertheless, I think we conclude by saying that the issue of security in Europe is extremely important. It will not go off our agenda. Russia plays a significant role. The European Union's role is still being defined, and we're very pleased to have had both of you as our contributors to this podcast, and I think it was excellent that we had Mark speaking directly from Moscow and Marcin from Warsaw. So thank you very much once again.